In a small, forgotten town buried deep in the woods, there was an old, crumbling toy shop that no one dared to enter. The shop had been abandoned for decades after its owner, the infamous Dollmaker, vanished under mysterious circumstances. Stories about him were whispered in fear. A man obsessed with creating lifelike dolls that seemed far too real. Some said he had a dark secret. His dolls weren't made. They were stolen souls. Tessa, a curious 15-year-old, had heard the stories all her life. But on a cold November evening, while walking home, she noticed something strange. The faint glow of a flickering light inside the toy shop. Her breath hitched. The shop had always been locked and silent, its grimy windows too thick with dust to see through. But now, the faint glow illuminated the sign above the door. The Dollmaker's workshop. The faded letters seemed to shimmer, and she felt an unexplainable pull towards the door. Against every ounce of her better judgment, Tessa stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of decay and sawdust. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with ancient cracked dolls. Their glassy eyes seemed to follow her as she walked. Some were missing limbs, others had eerie, crooked smiles that seemed too wide for their faces. In the center of the room was a workbench covered in tools, fabric scraps, and something she couldn't quite make out. A large object covered in a faded sheet. Tessa hesitated, her heart pounding, but something compelled her forward. She reached out and lifted the sheet. Underneath was a doll. No, a mannequin, or perhaps something in between. It was lifelike, far too detailed for comfort. The doll's eyes were closed, its long, delicate fingers resting on its lap. The face was eerily beautiful, but unsettlingly familiar. Tessa gasped. It looked just like her. Suddenly, the door behind her slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the room. The faint light flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls. The dolls on the shelves seemed to shift, their heads turning ever so slightly to watch her. She backed away from the table, her breathing ragged, and froze when she heard it, a soft, raspy voice. "Do you like it?" Tessa whipped around, her eyes scanning the room, but she saw no one. The voice came again, this time closer. "I made it just for you." Her gaze snapped back to the doll on the table. Its eyes were open now, wide, unblinking, and filled with an unnatural glow. Its head tilted slowly, and its lips curled into a smile. Tessa screamed and stumbled backward into the shelves, knocking over a row of dolls. They toppled to the floor, shattering, but inside the broken porcelain were not empty cavities. No, there were teeth, bones, and tiny mummified faces. The room filled with the sound of laughter, high-pitched, childlike, but twisted, as if mocking her. The shadows on the walls grew longer, darker, and began to move. Tessa's chest heaved as she bolted for the door, pulling and yanking at the handle. But it wouldn't budge. Behind her, the Dollmaker spoke again, his voice dripping with malice. "You came looking for me, didn't you? Now you'll stay." She turned slowly, tears streaming down her face, and saw him. The Dollmaker emerged from the shadows, his face sunken and leathery, his eyes glowing the same unnatural light as the doll's. He held a needle and threads in one hand, and in the other, a porcelain faceplate. Tessa backed into the door, clawing at it in desperation as he advanced. "Don't worry," he said with a wicked grin. "You'll be perfect, just like the others." The dolls on the floor began to twitch, their shattered pieces pulling together, forming grotesque, malformed figures. They crawled toward her on broken limbs, their faces twisting into expressions of agony and glee. The last thing Tessa saw was the Dollmaker, leaning over her, his needle piercing her skin as her screams echoed through the shop. The next morning, the light in the toy shop was gone, and the town remained as quiet as ever. But if you dared to look through the grimy window, you might notice a new doll sitting on the shelf, her eyes wide with terror, and her face eerily familiar. From that day on, the shop remained silent, but the doll's eyes always seemed to follow you, waiting for the next curious soul to wander inside.